The hinges scream. It is a sound that has echoed through the Ural Mountains for centuries, the shriek of iron against iron, the protest of rusted steel. But on this night, in the downstairs kitchen of a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, the sound carries a finality it has never known before. The cook, a round man with flour-dusted sleeves, pries open a door that leads not to a pantry, but to a narrow, empty room in the basement. He holds it for the family that shuffles past him. They descend, 11 people, herded by men with revolvers and hatred in their eyes. A former emperor, his shoulders rounded not by age, but by the weight of 3 centuries, carries his son in his arms. The boy is 13, but his legs, ravaged by a royal disease, dangle uselessly. Beside them, 4 women in white blouses and dark skirts move with a grace that the grimy walls cannot diminish. They bring pillows. They bring chairs. They bring the small, desperate comforts of a life that is about to end. The Tsarina, once the most glamorous consort in Europe, crosses herself and whispers a prayer in English, her native tongue. Her daughters follow. The room is small, the ceiling low, the single electric bulb casting a sickly yellow light that paints their faces in hollows of yellow and grey. They have no way of knowing that this is the last light they will ever see. They stand there, a portrait of faded majesty, waiting for a photographer who will never come. They are waiting for a picture. Instead, they will receive a storm of lead. To understand the shadow they cast, we must first step into the light that forged them. Chapter 1: The Seed of an Empire. The winter of 1613 does not simply arrive in Russia. It descends, a living thing with teeth of frost and lungs that exhale blizzards. It buries the roads, snaps the limbs of ancient oaks, and seeps through the walls of even the holiest sanctuaries. In the Ipatiev Monastery, near the town of Kostroma, the cold is a constant, unwelcome guest. It clings to the stone corridors, makes the candle flames tremble, and turns the breath of the living into clouds of ghostly vapor. Inside a small cell, a boy sits by a narrow window. He is 16 years old, with a gentle, almost pretty face that seems too soft for the times he has been born into. His name is Mikhail Romanov. His fingers, long and pale, worry the edge of a wooden cross as he stares out at the snow, which falls like a silent, endless curtain. Outside the walls, wolves have been howling all night, their cries carrying over the frozen wilderness. Mikhail understands those wolves. He feels their hunger, their desperation, out there in the white. His world has been a long, cold scream. He barely remembers a time before the chaos. They call it the Smuta, the time of troubles, 15 years of hell. 15 years since the last Tsar of the ancient Rurikid dynasty died without an heir, plunging Russia into an abyss. Famine had come first, a great hunger that drove people to eat straw, then bark, then, it was whispered each other. Cannibals prowled the roads. Then came the pretenders, false Dimitris who claimed the throne, backed by Polish lords and Cossack raiders. The boy's own father, a powerful priest, had been dragged from a cathedral and thrown into a Polish prison. His mother had fled with him, hiding in this very monastery, a fortress of God in a land abandoned by God. To be a Romanov in this time is to be a target. To be any noble, any boyar with a drop of royal blood or a whisper of ambition is to sign your own death warrant. Mikhail has learned to be silent. He has learned to listen. The sound of a hoofbeat on the frozen road outside the walls makes his heart stop. He lives in the space between breaths. He is pulled from his vigil by the soft rustle of wool. His mother, the elder Martha, enters the cell. She has taken the veil, becoming a nun to survive, but the cloth cannot hide the steel in her spine or the fierce, protective fire in her eyes. She looks at her son, this boy she has shielded from assassins and mobs, from the very chaos of history. They are still here, she says, her voice a low, tired rasp. They will not leave. Mikhail knows who she means. A great assembly, a Zemsky Soba, has gathered in Moscow. Boyars, churchmen, merchants, and Cossacks, men who just months ago were cutting each other's throats, have somehow come together. They are trying to stitch a crown back together. They are trying to choose a new Tsar. And now, their messengers have tracked the Romanovs to this frozen sanctuary. They are not here to pay homage. They are here to make an offer that no one in their right mind would accept. From the central square of the monastery, the sound of argument drifts through the thick walls, a low, persistent murmur like the growl of distant thunder. Men are shouting, men are debating, they are deciding his fate. They will ask, Martha says, her gaze fixed on her son. They will come with icons and prostrations, they will beg you to save them. Mikhail looks up at her, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. And what do I say, mother? Her hand, cold and thin, reaches out and grips his. You say no. The words hang in the frozen air, a prayer and a command. For what is the crown of Russia in 1613? It is not a prize, it is a sentence. The last few czars have been murdered, poisoned, or overthrown. The treasury is empty. The Poles occupy the western lands. The Swedes are in the north. Bands of armed brigands roam the countryside, burning villages and enslaving the peasants. To be czar is to be the ultimate target, a solitary figure standing on a hill in a hailstorm, waiting for the lightning to strike. But as the afternoon light fades to bruised purple, the footsteps come, heavy, purposeful. The abbot himself leads the delegation. Martha pushes Mikhail behind her, a she-wolf guarding her cub. The door to their cell opens, and the cold rushes in, along with men in heavy furs, their faces raw from the journey, their eyes wide with a strange, unsettling mix of desperation and awe. They carry an icon of the Virgin of Vladimir, the holiest image in Russia, its gold leaf shimmering in the candlelight. They fall to their knees on the cold stone floor, their knees cracking against it. They do not see a frightened boy. They see the answer to their prayers. They see the end of the nightmare. One of them, the archbishop, speaks, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fervor. "Mikhail Fedorovich," he intones, "do not despise the entreaty of your people. The whole land begs you. Accept the throne of the Tsars of Moscow and save us all." The silence that follows is deeper than the snow outside. Mikhail looks at his mother. Her face is a mask of stone, but he feels her hand, the one still holding his, tremble. He looks at the kneeling men, their heads bowed, their shoulders heaving with sobs of relief that they have finally found him. He looks at the icon, the serene face of the Mother of God, and feels the weight of 300 years of history pressing down on him, a weight he never asked for, never wanted. The wolves howl again in the distance. And in that tiny cell, a boy stands at the precipice of an empire, the fate of a nation resting on a single word. The men kneeling on the cold stone floor do not rise. They remain there, their foreheads pressed to the ground, their fur-trimmed robes pooling around them like the melted remains of a snowdrift. They have traveled for weeks through bandit-infested forests, fording rivers choked with ice to find this boy. To them, he is not Mikhail, the 16-year-old son of a disgraced priest. He is a vessel. He is the last, fragile hope that Russia might yet be pieced back together. Mikhail looks at his mother, and in her eyes he sees a war more terrible than any fought on a battlefield. He sees the memory of her husband, Filaret, dragged away in chains, his face bloodied, his priestly robes torn. He sees the years of running, of hiding, of watching her children die from fever and hunger in drafty rooms. He sees the faces of pretenders who were paraded through the streets of Moscow only to be hacked to pieces by mobs. To say yes is to risk all of that, and worse. To say yes is to paint a target on her son's back so large that no wall, no monastery, no army could ever protect him. "The boy is too young," she says, her voice cutting through the reverent silence. It is not a plea. It is a statement of fact, a shield she throws between her son and the kneeling men. He has not the strength for such a burden. He has not the wisdom. The archbishop lifts his head. His face, weathered by wind and fasting, is streaked with tears. "Holy Mother," he says, his voice cracking, "there is no one else. The Boyars scheme. The Poles laugh at us from the Kremlin they still hold. The Swedes sharpen their knives in Novgorod. We have nothing left but faith, and our faith tells us that God has preserved this youth for this very hour." He gestures to the icon they have brought, its surface glowing in the dim light. "This image has protected Russia for centuries. Will you deny its call? Will you let the light of orthodoxy be extinguished because a mother fears for her son?" The words are a lash. Martha flinches as if struck. She knows the weight of duty. She is a Romanov by marriage, but she is a woman of her time, raised on the stories of saints who accepted martyrdom with a smile. To refuse the will of God, as spoken through the people, is to court damnation, but to accept is to court death. Mikhail speaks for the first time. His voice is soft, almost a whisper, but it carries in the small stone room. "What of my father?" The question hangs in the air. His father, Filaret, is a prisoner of the Polish king, held in a damp castle far to the west. If Mikhail becomes Tsar, what will happen to him? Will the Poles use him as a bargaining chip? Will they kill him out of spite? Or worse, will they try to use him to control his son, to plant a puppet on the Russian throne? The delegates exchange glances. They have no answer. They have only their desperation. "The people have chosen you," the archbishop says finally, avoiding the question. "The Cossacks threw their swords at our feet and swore they would fight for no one but a Romanov. The mobs in the streets are crying your name. If you refuse, there will be anarchy. The nobles will tear each other apart, and Russia will die. He is not exaggerating. The time of troubles has shown them all the face of chaos. They have seen churches looted and desecrated. They have seen children sold for a sack of grain. They have seen the very idea of Russia, the holy land of Kiev and Vladimir and Moscow, reduced to a carcass fought over by wolves. Martha turns to her son. She places both hands on his shoulders, her grip firm despite her age. She searches his face, looking for the boy she raised, looking for the fear she knows is there. But what she sees surprises her. She sees something flicker behind his gentle eyes. Not ambition, not greed, something else. A kind of sad, weary acceptance. "What would you have me do, mother?" he asks again, but this time the question is different. This time it is not a plea for protection, it is a request for permission. The moment stretches. The candle gutters, sending shadows dancing across the walls like the ghosts of all the dead czars who came before. Outside, the wind howls, shaking the window frame. And then Martha does something that will echo through 3 centuries. She releases his shoulders. She steps aside. She bows her head, not to the delegates, but to her son. "If this is the will of God," she whispers, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, "then who are we to refuse?" Delegates erupt. They surge forward, reaching for Mikhail's hands, for the hem of his simple tunic, weeping, laughing, praising God. But Mikhail does not see them. He looks past them, out the narrow window, at the endless snow. He is thinking of his father in a Polish prison. He is thinking of the men who will now call him Tsar, men who just weeks ago might have been his enemies. He is thinking of the weight that has just settled on his shoulders, invisible but heavier than any iron crown. He is the first Romanov Tsar, and he has just said yes to a death sentence. The journey from Kostromar to Moscow should take 2 weeks. For the new Tsar, it takes more than a month. The roads are not merely dangerous, they are haunted. Every frozen forest could hide a band of Lisoksisi, the dreaded Polish irregulars who raid and burn with impunity. Every village they pass is a graveyard, its blackened chimneys standing like skeletal fingers against the grey sky. Mikhail travels not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive, escorted by a makeshift army of monks, loyal nobles, and Cossacks who have sworn to protect him with their lives. He rides in a simple sleigh, wrapped in furs, his mother at his side. The delegates who knelt before him now ride ahead, scanning the tree line for threats. They have traded their tears of joy for the hard eyes of soldiers. They know that the coronation means nothing if the Tsar never reaches the capital. At night they shelter in monasteries and the homes of loyal boyars. In each place, Mikhail is presented with petitions, scrolls of parchment covered in crabbed handwriting, pleading for justice, for bread, for protection from the marauders. He reads them by candlelight, his brow furrowed, his young face agging with each word. He learns that Russia is not a kingdom, it is a wound. His mother watches him. She sees the weight pressing down, the way his shoulders have already begun to curve. One night, in a cramped cell not unlike the one they left behind, she sits beside him as he reads yet another petition, a farmer's wife, describing how her husband was killed and her daughters taken by Polish soldiers. "You cannot save them all," Martha says quietly. Mikhail looks up, and for a moment he is just a boy again, lost and frightened. Then what is the point of being Tsar? The question hangs between them. It is the same question that will haunt his descendants for 300 years. What is the point of absolute power if it cannot stop the suffering of a single farmer's wife? What is the point of a crown if it cannot shield the innocent? Martha has no answer. She reaches out and takes the petition from his hands, setting it aside. "You will learn," she says, "that being Tsar is not about saving everyone. It is about choosing who to save and living with the ones you could not. It is a brutal education, and it has only just begun." When they finally approach Moscow, the sight stops them cold. The city that was once the glory of Russia, the Third Rome, the center of the Orthodox world, lies in ruins. The Kremlin walls still stand, but they are scarred by cannon fire. The cathedrals within have been desecrated by Polish soldiers who stabled their horses in the sanctuaries. The streets are empty, the buildings gutted. A population that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands has been reduced to a desperate few, emerging from cellars and ruins to stare at the procession with hollow eyes. These are the people who will be his subjects, These are the people he is meant to rule. A delegation meets him at the city gates, boyars in threadbare finery, priests in vestments stained with smoke, merchants who have lost everything but their faith. They fall to their knees in the muddy snow, and their cry rises as one voice. "Give us a Tsar, give us a father." Mikhail steps from the sleigh. He walks among them, his boots sinking into the slush. He reaches out and touches the shoulder of an old man whose face is a map of suffering. He looks into the eyes of a woman clutching a child who is little more than skin and bone. He does not speak. He has no words for this. He simply looks, and in looking, he accepts. The coronation takes place on July 22, 1613, in the Dormition Cathedral inside the Kremlin. The cathedral has been hastily restored, the worst of the desecration scrubbed away, but the smell of smoke still lingers in the ancient stones. Mikhail, dressed in robes heavy with gold and jewels that belonged to Tsars before him, walks beneath the vaulted ceilings where Ivan the Terrible once prayed. The choir chants, their voices rising to the dome like the prayers of a nation. When the moment comes, the Metropolitan places the monomax cap upon Mikhail's head, the golden, fur-trimmed crown said to have been gifted to a Kievan prince by the Byzantine emperor himself. It is ancient, heavy, and utterly absurd in its opulence. It sits on the boy's head like a mountain. As the choir sings, "Many years," Mikhail looks out at the assembled nobles, the priests, the foreign ambassadors. He sees his mother in the front row, her face wet with tears. He sees the hard faces of boyars who opposed his election, watching him with calculating eyes. He sees the hope, fragile as a candle flame, flickering in the faces of the common people who have crowded into the square outside. He is Tsar, he is 16 years old, and he has just inherited a country that does not exist. The boy who became Tsar learns quickly that a crown does not make a king. In the months that follow his coronation, Mikhail Romanov discovers the terrible truth of his new existence. He is a hostage to the very men who placed him on the throne. The boyars circle like wolves. They bow low in his presence, their foreheads nearly touching the floor, but their eyes never stop watching, never stop calculating. They test him constantly, a delayed report here, a contradictory opinion there, a subtle challenge to an order he has given. They want to know if this 16-year-old has a spine. They want to know if they can rule through him, if they can make him a puppet whose strings they pull. Mikhail learns to watch their hands. A boyar's hands tell the truth when his mouth lies. He learns to read the room, to sense the shift in mood before anyone speaks, to know when to press and when to yield. It is not kingship as he imagined it. It is survival. His mother, Martha, remains his closest advisor. She has not returned to her convent. She cannot. Her son needs her, and she will not abandon him to the wolves. She sits in on council meetings, her veiled presence a silent rebuke to any man who might seek to intimidate her child. When the boyars grumble, when they suggest that a woman has no place in the affairs of state, Martha fixes them with a stare that has frozen stronger men. They learn to hold their tongues. But even Martha cannot solve the problems that pile up like snowdrifts against the Kremlin walls. The treasury is the first crisis. There is no money. The coffers that once held gold for wars and weddings and coronations are empty. The Polish occupation stripped everything of value. The famine years consumed the rest. Mikhail's own coronation was paid for by desperate loans from wealthy monasteries, and those debts are now coming due. The army is the second crisis. There is no army. The few troops who remain are loyal to local commanders, not to the Tsar. They are unpaid, unfed, and increasingly mutinous. Cossack bands roam the countryside, nominally loyal to the new dynasty, but in practice serving only themselves. When they demand payment for their support, Mikhail has nothing to give them. The land itself is the third crisis. Whole regions have been depopulated. Villages stand empty, their inhabitants dead or fled. Fields lie fallow, returning to forest. The surviving peasants are so crushed by taxes and terror that they can barely feed themselves, let alone produce a surplus for the state. And beyond Russia's borders, the enemies wait. The Poles still hold Smolensk. The Swedes have taken Novgorod. They watch the chaos in Moscow with hungry eyes, waiting for the moment to strike again, to finish what they started in the time of troubles. In the winter of 1614, a letter arrives from the Polish king. It is addressed not to Tsar Mikhail, but to Mikhail Romanov, pretender. The message is simple. Poland does not recognize his coronation. Poland considers him an usurper. Poland will continue to press its own claim to the Russian throne. Mikhail reads the letter in silence. Then he folds it carefully and sets it aside. He does not rage. He does not weep. He has learned that rage and tears are luxuries a Tsar cannot afford. He simply nods to his secretary and says, "File it with the others." The secretary hesitates. "Your Majesty, there is more. The king's men have approached several of the boyars. They are offering bribes, promising lands and titles to any who will switch their allegiance." Mikhail looks up. For a moment, the mask slips, and the boy beneath is visible, frightened, uncertain, overwhelmed. But only for a moment. Then the mask is back, and the Tsar speaks. "Let them try," he says quietly. "We will see whose loyalty is for sale." It is a brave statement, but both he and his secretary know the truth. Nearly every man's loyalty is for sale. The only question is the price. That spring, the first test comes. A powerful boyar named Mikhail Saltykov, a man who knelt before the young Tsar at his coronation, defects to the Polish side. He takes with him not only his own troops, but crucial intelligence about the Kremlin's defenses. The news arrives on a grey morning, carried by a messenger who has ridden through the night. Martha finds her son in the chapel, kneeling before an icon of the Virgin. He is not praying, or rather, he is praying, but his lips are still, his eyes open. He is simply there, in the presence of something larger than himself, trying to find the strength to go on. "Your father would be proud of you," Martha says softly. Mikhail does not turn. "My father is in a Polish prison. He may be dead for all we know. He is alive. I would feel it if he were gone. Then he is alive, and he is a prisoner, and I am Tsar, and I cannot free him." Mikhail's voice cracks on the last word. What kind of Tsar cannot free his own father? Martha comes to stand beside him. She looks up at the icon, at the sorrowful eyes of the Virgin, at the child in her arms. "The kind of Tsar who learns," she says, "the kind who endures, the kind who builds, stone by stone, until one day the walls are strong enough to protect everyone he loves." Mikhail is silent for a long moment. Then he rises, stiff from kneeling, and turns to face his mother. His eyes are red-rimmed, but dry. "Then we build," he says. And so it begins. Not with glory, not with conquest, not with the grand ambitions of empire. It begins with survival. It begins with borrowing from monasteries to pay soldiers. It begins with sending desperate letters to foreign courts, begging for recognition, for loans, for alliances. It begins with small victories, a Cossack leader persuaded to swear loyalty, a boyar won back with promises and pardons, a village that manages to plant and harvest without being raided. It is inglorious work. It is the work of a caretaker, not a conqueror, but it is necessary, for an empire cannot be built on ashes. The ashes must first be cleared away, the ground must be prepared, the seed must be protected until it is strong enough to withstand the storms. Mikhail Romanov, the reluctant Tsar, the frightened boy who said yes in a freezing monastery cell, becomes the gardener of Russia. He will never be great. He will never be remembered with the awe reserved for conquerors and reformers. But he will be remembered as the one who held the line, who kept the flame alive, who passed on to his son a kingdom that, however fragile, however poor, however threatened, still existed. And that, in 1614, is no small thing. The years pass like the slow crawl of a wounded animal. Each one brings its own crises, its own small battles, its own quiet triumphs that no one but the clerks and chroniclers will ever remember. By 1619, Mikhail is no longer a boy. He is 22, with a beard that makes him look older and eyes that have seen too much. He has learned to ride through Moscow's streets without flinching at the crowds, to sign death warrants without trembling, to receive foreign ambassadors with the proper mixture of dignity and suspicion. He has fathered a daughter who died in infancy, and the grief of it has carved lines into his face that will never fade. But this year brings something unexpected. This year, his father comes home. The negotiations have been ongoing for years. The Poles, weary of war and distracted by their own troubles, finally agree to a prisoner exchange. Filaret Romanov, the metropolitan who was dragged from a cathedral 16 years ago, is released. He travels to Moscow not as a broken man, but as something far more formidable, a survivor. Mikhail rides out to meet him. The procession winds through the countryside, past villages that have begun to rebuild, past fields that are green with new crops. When they meet, father and son embrace in the middle of the road, and for a moment, the Tsar of all Russia is simply a son who has missed his father. Filaret looks at this young man who wears the crown that should have been his. He sees the weight in his son's shoulders, the caution in his eyes, the way he glances at the guards before relaxing. He sees what 16 years of rule have done to his boy, and he makes a decision. When they return to Moscow, Filaret does not retire to a monastery. He does not fade into the background. He accepts the title of Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, the highest position in the Orthodox Church. And then, quietly, without fanfare, he begins to rule. The boyars notice immediately. Where Mikhail hesitated, Filaret acts. Where Mikhail consulted, Filaret commands. The father has spent 16 years in prison, plotting, planning, dreaming of what he would do if he ever regained power. The son has spent 16 years struggling merely to survive. Together, they form an unlikely partnership. The Patriarch and the Tsar, father and son, ruling Russia as no one has ever ruled it before. The dual reign transforms the government. Filaret brings the experience of a man who has seen the worst that life can offer. He is ruthless where Mikhail is merciful, decisive where Mikhail is cautious. He purges the government of corrupt officials, restructures the tax system, rebuilds the army. He does not ask permission. He simply acts, and the boyars, accustomed to pushing around the young Tsar, find themselves facing a man who cannot be intimidated. Mikhail, for his part, does not resent his father's influence. On the contrary, he welcomes it. For the first time since he was 16 years old, he is not alone. There is someone else who carries the weight, someone else who lies awake at night, worrying about the Poles and the Swedes and the hungry peasants. There is someone else who understands. In the evenings, they walk together in the Kremlin gardens, such as they are, still recovering from years of neglect. They talk of policy and prayer, of the boyars and the bishops, of the son Mikhail will one day have, the heir who must be prepared for this impossible inheritance. Filaret teaches his son what prison taught him, that a man can endure anything if he knows who he is. That faith is not a luxury, but a necessity. That power is not a gift, but a loan, to be repaid with interest to the next generation. The 1620s become a decade of rebuilding. The treasury slowly fills. The army slowly strengthens. The borders slowly stabilize. It is not glorious work. There are no great victories, no conquered territories, no monuments raised to immortal glory, but there is bread in the markets. There are children playing in the streets. There are priests chanting in churches that no longer smell of smoke. This is the Romanov foundation, not conquest but endurance, not glory but survival. In 1629, the heir is born. They name him Alexis. Mikhail holds the infant in his arms, this tiny creature who will one day wear the crown, and he feels something he has not felt in years, hope. Not the desperate hope of a boy praying for survival, but the quiet, steady hope of a man who has built something that might last. He looks at his father, standing in the doorway of the nursery, and sees the same thought in the old man's eyes. The seed has become a sapling. The sapling has become a tree. And now there is a new seed, ready to be planted in the same blood-soaked soil. The Romanovs will continue. Mikhail rules for 32 years in total. When he dies in 1645, at the age of 48, he is worn out, exhausted by a lifetime of carrying a weight he never asked for. But he dies in his bed, surrounded by his family, with the prayers of the church on his lips. In the history of Russian autocracy, this is no small thing. Many of his predecessors were murdered. Many of his descendants will be murdered. But Mikhail, the reluctant Tsar, the frightened boy who said yes in a freezing monastery cell, dies peacefully. His son Alexis inherits a kingdom that is still poor, still weak, still surrounded by enemies. But it is a kingdom that exists. It is a kingdom that has hope. And that, in 1645, is a kind of miracle. Seed has taken root. The first chapter of the Romanov story is complete, but the story itself has only just begun. For in the generations to come, the tree will grow, twisted by storms, scarred by lightning, bearing fruit both sweet and poisonous. It will produce a giant who will drag Russia into the modern world by its hair. It will produce a German princess who will become the greatest ruler the dynasty ever knew. It will produce madmen and martyrs, reformers and reactionaries. And finally, 300 years after that frightened boy said yes in a monastery cell, it will produce a family standing in a basement, waiting for a photograph that will never come. But that is still far in the future. For now, in the warm glow of a Moscow sunset, a father passes the crown to his son, The candles are lit, the prayers are said, the empire endures. For now, Chapter 2, The Reformer and His Shadow. The boy who would become Peter the Great is 4 years old when his father dies. It is 1676, and Moscow is a city of wooden buildings and golden domes, of muddy streets and glittering cathedrals, of ancient tradition and simmering violence. The boy, Peter, is left in the care of his mother, Natalia, a woman whose grace and intelligence cannot compensate for the one thing she lacks: powerful friends. The Kremlin becomes a nest of vipers. Peter's half-brother Fyodor takes the throne, but he is sickly and weak, his body ravaged by the same mysterious disease that haunts the Romanov blood. Behind him circle the Miloslavskis, the family of his mother, their eyes fixed on the future, their hands reaching for power. They see Peter and his mother as obstacles. They see the boy's innocent face and imagine it replaced by a coffin. Peter learns his first lesson in these years. The world is not safe. The world is a place where smiles hide daggers, where aunts and uncles become enemies overnight, where a child can be forgotten in a corridor while adults decide his fate. He learns to watch, to listen, to trust no one but his mother and the rough men who serve as his playmates, soldiers and servants who teach him to fight, to swear, to survive. When Fyodor dies in 1682, the crisis explodes. The boyars gather in the Kremlin to choose a new Tsar. 2 candidates stand before them: Peter, healthy and bright, and his other half-brother Ivan, who is nearly blind, barely able to speak, and afflicted with what later generations will recognize as severe intellectual disabilities. The choice seems obvious. The boyars proclaim Peter the new Tsar. But the Miloslavskis do not accept defeat. They have a weapon more powerful than any argument: the Streltsy, the musketeers of the Moscow garrison. These are not disciplined soldiers, but a mutinous mob, armed and dangerous, nursing grievances over pay and privilege. The Miloslavskis whisper to them. They tell the Streltsy that the Nareshkins, Peter's family, plan to kill Ivan, to exterminate the true line, to steal the throne. They light a fuse that will burn for days. On May 15, 1682, the Streltsy storm the Kremlin. They burst into the palace, their boots echoing on the ancient stones, their muskets loaded, their eyes wild with rage. They demand the heads of the Nareshkin traitors. When the boyars try to calm them, they drag the Nareshkins from hiding places and butcher them in the palace courtyard. 10-year-old Peter watches from a balcony. He sees his mother's brothers thrown onto the spears of the mob. He hears their screams, sees the blood pooling on the cobblestones, watches the Streltsy wave their severed heads on pikes like trophies. He does not cry out. He does not faint. He watches and he remembers. This is the moment that shapes Peter the Great, not the shipyards of Holland, not the battlefields of Poltava, not the palaces of St. Petersburg. This, the blood of his uncles on the Kremlin stones, the screaming mob, the utter, absolute chaos of power collapsing into violence. He learns that the world is not merely unsafe. The world is a beast that must be tamed, dominated, bent to the will of whoever is strong enough to hold the whip. For the next 7 years, Peter is a Tsar in name only. He and his mother are sent to live in the village of Preobrazhenskoye, outside Moscow. The real power rests with his half-sister Sophia, a woman of immense ambition and intelligence who rules as regent, her face appearing on coins and icons, her name spoken in the same breath as the Tsar's. But Peter does not waste these years. He builds, he plays, he learns. He forms 2 regiments from the sons of servants and soldiers who surround him, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments, named for the villages where he lives. He drills them like a real army, marching them through the fields, teaching them to fire real muskets, leading them in mock battles that are more brutal than games have any right to be. He finds an old sailboat in a barn, a relic of more adventurous times, and teaches himself to sail on the ponds and rivers near Moscow. The West calls to him, even here, even now, in the person of foreign engineers and merchants who drift through the German quarter, bringing tales of lands where ships sail oceans and men use instruments to measure the stars. He grows tall, terrifyingly tall. By the time he is 17, he stands nearly 7 feet, a giant among Russians, his height a physical manifestation of the ambition swelling within him. His hands are huge, his energy boundless, his curiosity insatiable. He learns carpentry, printing, shipbuilding, anatomy. He drinks with soldiers and works beside laborers. He is Tsar, but he refuses to act like one. He wants to understand. He wants to master. He wants to build a world where no mob will ever again butcher his family on the stones of the Kremlin. In 1689, he is ready. Sophia, sensing his growing power, makes a move to crush him. She again stirs up the Streltsy, hoping to eliminate Peter once and for all. But Peter has learned the lessons of 1682 too well. He does not wait for the mob to come to him. He flees to the Trinity Monastery, a fortress of faith and stone, and calls his loyal regiments to his side. The Streltsy hesitate, the boyars waver, Sophia's support crumbles like dry earth. Within weeks, she is overthrown, confined to a convent, her face erased from coins and icons, her name spoken only in whispers. Peter returns to Moscow in triumph. He is 18 years old. He is the sole Tsar, and he has just begun. But the blood on the Kremlin stones is not yet dry, and the beast he has tamed is not yet broken. Power, Peter discovers, is not given, it is taken, and once taken, it must be held with a grip of iron. The young Tsar returns to Moscow in the autumn of 1689, but he does not return to the Kremlin. He cannot. The walls still echo with the screams of his uncles. The cobblestones still bear the stain of their blood. Instead, he retreats to Preobrazhenskoye, to the wooden palaces and dusty parade grounds where he spent his exile. He surrounds himself with his play soldiers, now hardened young men who would die for him without question. He surrounds himself with foreigners from the German quarter, men with strange accents and stranger ideas, who teach him about engines and astronomy and the art of war as it is practiced in the West. And he waits, not patiently. Peter is incapable of patience, but strategically. He watches his half-brother Ivan the Khazar fade further into the shadows of his own mind. He watches the boyars, those who survived the Streltsy massacre, try to read the future in his giant frame and restless eyes. He watches his mother, Natalia, try to steer him toward a conventional life, marriage, heirs, the slow rhythm of tradition that has governed Russian czars for centuries. For a time, he complies. In 1689, he marries Eudoxia Lopukina, a girl chosen by his mother, a beautiful face attached to a mind that cannot comprehend the furnace burning inside her husband. The marriage is a disaster from the first night. Peter wants a companion, a partner in his obsessions. Eudoxia wants a husband who will pray with her and sleep beside her and rule as czars are supposed to rule. She looks at his rough hands, calloused from carpentry, and shudders. He looks at her empty eyes and turns away. Within months, he has abandoned her for the shores of Lake Pleshchevo, where he builds boats and dreams of the sea. Within years, he will confine her to a convent, erasing her from his life as surely as Sophia was erased. But that is still to come. For now, he simply flees from her, from Moscow, from the weight of expectations that press down on his giant shoulders. The 1690s become a decade of preparation. Peter does not merely play at soldiers, he builds an army. The Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments grow into real fighting forces, drilled in European tactics, commanded by officers who earn their ranks through competence rather than birth. He does not merely dabble in shipbuilding, he founds a navy. On the White Sea at Arkhangelsk, he watches Dutch and English merchant ships ride the waves, and he burns with longing. Russia has ports, but Russia has no fleet. Russia has coasts, but Russia has no access to the warm seas where empires are made. He will change this. He does not know how yet, but he will. In 1695, he launches his first campaign. The target is Azov, a Turkish fortress blocking Russia's access to the Black Sea. The army he leads is the largest Russia has ever fielded, but it is also the most incompetent. The siege fails. The Turks laugh. Peter retreats in disgrace, but he does not despair. He analyzes. He learns. He builds a fleet on the Voronezh River over a single winter, ships rising from frozen timber, thousands of men working through the snow. In 1696, he returns to Azov. This time, the Turkish fortress falls. Russia has its first warm water port. But Peter knows this is only the beginning. Azov is a toehold, not a gateway. To truly break through, Russia must become something it has never been, a European power. And to become European, Peter must go to Europe himself. In 1697, he does the unthinkable. He abdicates, temporarily, symbolically, and joins a diplomatic mission to the West. But he does not travel as Tsar. He travels as Peter Mikhailov, a volunteer, a student, a man seeking to learn. He wants to see the world that built the ships and the forts and the cities he has only read about. He wants to understand the engines that drive the West. The journey transforms him. In Holland, he works in the shipyards of Zaandam, swinging an axe beside common laborers, eating their food, drinking their beer, asking endless questions. The Dutch shipwrights cannot believe this giant is the Tsar of all Russia. He builds a frigate with his own hands and sails it on the Zuiderzee. In England, he visits the royal dockyards at Diptford, studies the art of navigation, meets with Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren. He watches a parliamentary session from a secret balcony and remarks to his companions, "It is good to hear subjects speaking truth to their king. We must learn from this." But even as he learns, the shadows gather behind him. The Streltsy, restless and resentful, see his absence as an opportunity. They whisper of rebellion, of restoring the old ways, of placing Sophia back on the throne. In Moscow, Peter's governors write urgent letters, begging him to return. Peter reads them, files them away, and continues his studies. He will not be rushed. He will not be ruled by fear. When he finally returns in 1698, the rebellion has already been crushed by his generals. But Peter does not see a finished job. He sees a warning. He sees the same mob that butchered his uncles, still lurking in the shadows, still waiting for a chance to strike. And he decides, in that moment, that the Streltsy must not merely be defeated, they must be destroyed. What follows is a purge so thorough, so brutal, that even hardened soldiers turn away. Peter personally interrogates the rebels. He presides over torture sessions that last for days. He orders mass executions in Red Square, forcing the boyars to watch, forcing the foreign ambassadors to witness the fate of those who defy the Tsar. The heads of the Streltsy are mounted on the Kremlin walls, their sightless eyes staring down at the city they once terrorized. And in a gesture that will define his reign, Peter himself swings the axe. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. His giant frame, his calloused hands, his relentless energy all turn to the work of butchery. He does not delegate this task. He performs it personally, proving to himself and to Russia that he is not afraid to get his hands dirty, that he is not a Tsar who rules from a distance, that he is the master and the mob is his slave. When it is over, the Streltsy are no more. Their regiments are disbanded. Their families are scattered. Their memory is erased. Peter has killed the beast that haunted his childhood, but in killing it, he has become something else, something harder, something that will stop at nothing to remake Russia in his image. The reformer has emerged from the shadow, and his shadow is growing longer by the day. The axe falls not only on his enemies, but on the past itself. Peter stands in the blood of the Streltsy and sees, not horror, but opportunity. The new century dawns with Russia on the brink of transformation. Peter has crushed the old guard, but crushing is not creating. He must now build something in the space left by destruction. In 1700, he declares war on Sweden. It is a madness that makes his advisors weep. Sweden possesses the most formidable army in Northern Europe, led by a military genius, King Charles XII, who is barely out of his teens but already undefeated in battle. Russia possesses an army that, just 2 years ago, was still using bows and arrows alongside muskets. The logic of war says Russia will be crushed. But Peter does not think in terms of logic. He thinks in terms of necessity. Russia needs the Baltic coast. Russia needs ports that do not freeze for half the year. Russia needs windows into Europe. If the price of that window is war with Sweden, then war it will be. The first battle is a catastrophe. At Narva in November 1700, Charles XII leads a small Swedish force against Peter's massive army. The Russians outnumber the Swedes nearly 4-1, but they are poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly led. Charles attacks during a blizzard, the snow swirling around his soldiers like ghosts. The Russian lines collapse, panic spreads, the cavalry flees, the infantry surrenders. Thousands of Russian soldiers are killed or captured. The Swedish king loses fewer than 700 men. When news reaches Moscow, the boyars weep, the priests pray, the people mutter that God has abandoned them, but Peter does not weep, he does not pray, he works. The defeat at Narva is not a signal to retreat, it is a diagnosis. Russia's army is a patient, sick unto death, and Peter is the surgeon. He begins to operate. Next decade becomes a fever dream of conscription and construction. Peter drafts peasants by the tens of thousands, turning farmers into soldiers. He melts church bells to cast cannons, stripping the monasteries of their sacred bronze. He builds factories to produce muskets, uniforms, gunpowder. He imposes taxes so heavy that villages simply disappear, their inhabitants fleeing into the forests to escape the collectors. He demands more, always more. The war consumes everything. And slowly, impossibly, it begins to work. In 1702, Russian forces capture the Swedish fortress of Nuremberg at the source of the Neva River. In 1703, they take Nyenskans, a small Swedish outpost near the Baltic. Peter stands on the banks of the Neva, where the river widens into a delta, and sees what no one else can see. He sees a city. On May 16, 1703, he takes a bayonet and cuts 2 strips of turf from the marshy ground. He lays them in the shape of a cross and declares, "Here a city shall be." The men around him think he has lost his mind. This place is nothing. Swamp, forest, wolves, mosquitoes. The river floods every spring, turning the land into a shallow sea. There is no stone, no timber, no food, no shelter. Building a city here would be like building on the moon. Peter does not care. He orders them to build. The city that will become St. Petersburg rises from the mud on the backs of serfs. Peter conscripts laborers from across Russia, sending them to the Neva Delta by the thousands. They work in chains, in rain, in snow, in the killing cold of winter and the swarming insects of summer. They dig canals with their bare hands. They drive piles into the marsh with hammers that weigh more than they do. They die by the tens of thousands, of fever, of starvation, of exhaustion. Their bodies are buried in the foundations, their bones becoming part of the city's skeleton. Peter knows this. He does not stop. He cannot stop. The war continues and the city is his obsession. He names it after his patron saint, but everyone understands the true name: Peter's city, Peter's dream, Peter's madness. While the city rises, the war rages. Charles XII, having crushed Denmark and Poland, turns his attention east. In 1708, he invades Russia with an army of 40,000 veterans. He plans to march on Moscow to dictate peace in the Kremlin itself. Peter does not meet him in open battle. Instead, he retreats, burning the land as he goes. Villages go up in smoke, crops are torched, wells are poisoned. The Swedes march through a wasteland, their supplies dwindling, their morale cracking. The winter of 1708 is the coldest in living memory. Swedish soldiers freeze to death on the march. Their horses die in harness. Their guns jam with ice. Charles presses on, stubborn, brilliant, doomed. On June 27, 1709, the 2 armies meet at Poltava in what is now Ukraine. Peter has learned the lessons of Narva. His army is drilled, equipped, confident. He fights beside his men, a giant in a simple uniform, a bullet grazing his hat, another passing through his saddle. When the Swedish lines finally break, he rides among the fleeing enemy, shouting, "The stone is cut, the Swedish lion is dead." Poltava is the turning point. Sweden never recovers. Russia becomes the dominant power in the north. The window to Europe is forced open, and Peter's city on the swamp is no longer a madman's fantasy. It is the new capital. It is the future. In 1712, Peter declares St. Petersburg the capital of Russia. The court, the government, the nobles, all must leave Moscow, leave the Kremlin, leave the 1,000-year heart of their civilization, and move to this raw, wet, half-built city on the edge of the world. They complain bitterly. Peter ignores them. He has built a city on bones. He will build an empire the same way. But the builder is not finished. The city is only the beginning. Peter has seen the West, and he will not rest until Russia is remade in its image. He will cut the beards of his nobles with his own hands. He will force them to wear Western clothes, to dance Western dances, to speak in ways that shame their fathers. He will reform the church, the government, the army, the alphabet. He will drag Russia into the modern world by its hair, and anyone who resists will feel the weight of his fist. The shadow lengthens, and in its darkness a sun waits. The sun's name is Alexei. He is Peter's heir, his namesake, his disappointment. From the earliest days, the relationship between father and son is a study in contrast. Peter is giant, restless, brutal, brilliant. Alexei is slight, thoughtful, fearful, conventional. Peter loves ships and battles and the coarse company of soldiers. Alexei loves books and icons and the quiet comfort of priests. Peter looks at his son and sees everything he despises in old Russia: the passivity, the piety, the preference for prayer over action. Alexei looks at his father and sees a monster. The tragedy is that both are right. Peter tries in his way to mold his son. He drags Alexei on campaigns, forces him to work alongside laborers, demands that he learn the arts of war and government. But Alexei cannot keep up. He falls ill. He falls behind. He falls into the arms of those who whisper that his father is the Antichrist, that the old ways are the true ways, that one day, when Peter is gone, Russia will return to its senses. These whispers are dangerous. Peter knows them. He has spent his life crushing them. To hear them echoing in his own son's chambers is a betrayal beyond measure. In 1715, the crisis comes. Peter issues an ultimatum: reform or be disinherited. Alexei, paralyzed by fear, does neither. He flees. Under cover of night, he abandons Russia, traveling through Poland and Germany until he reaches Vienna, where he throws himself on the mercy of the Holy Roman Emperor. He begs for protection. He begs for asylum. He begs to be anything other than the son of Peter the Great. When news reaches St. Petersburg, Peter's rage is volcanic. His son, his heir, has not only rejected him, but has fled to foreign courts, exposing Romanov weakness to the world. This is not merely a personal betrayal. It is a political catastrophe. Peter dispatches his most trusted agents to hunt Alexei down, to bring him back, to face the consequences. For months, Alexei is sheltered by the Austrians, moved from castle to castle, always one step ahead of his father's hunters. But Peter's reach is long. His agents offer bribes, make threats, weave a web of diplomacy that eventually traps the fugitive. In 1718, Alexei agrees to return. He is promised his father's forgiveness. He is promised safety. He is promised peace. He is promised lies. The moment Alexei crosses back into Russia, he is arrested. Peter does not embrace him. Peter does not forgive him. Peter interrogates him. The questions go on for days, then weeks. What did you plan? Who helped you? Who whispered treason in your ear? Alexei answers as best he can, naming names, confessing his fears, begging for mercy. He signs everything they put before him. He believes that confession will bring absolution. It does not. Peter orders a formal investigation. He appoints a tribunal of judges, ministers, generals, all of them loyal to him, all of them eager to prove their devotion. They question Alexei under torture. The thin son, the bookish heir, the boy who only wanted to be left alone with his icons, is stretched on the rack. His joints pop. His back breaks. He screams names that the torturers already know. In June 1718, Alexei dies in the Peter and Paul fortress, the very prison his father built to house enemies of the state. The official cause of death is apoplexy, a stroke brought on by the shock of sentencing. But everyone knows the truth. The Tsarevich was tortured to death on his father's orders. Peter the Great, the reformer, the builder, the giant who dragged Russia into the modern world, has murdered his own son. The court is silent. The boyars avert their eyes. The foreign ambassadors write hurried dispatches to their capitals, describing the horror they cannot quite believe, but no one speaks, no one protests, no one dares. Peter does not mourn. He cannot afford to. He has a country to run, a war to finish, a city to complete. He buries Alexei in the fortress cathedral next to his first wife, the discarded Eudoxia, who has spent years in a convent, praying for the son she will never see again. Then he returns to work. But something has changed. The giant is still giant, but there is a hollowness now, a shadow within the shadow. He has killed the past, but he has also killed the future. Alexei was his only surviving son. The dynasty now rests on the shoulders of a toddler, Peter's son by his second wife, Catherine, a boy who may or may not survive the diseases of childhood. Peter pushes on. He has no choice. The reforms continue. The navy grows. The city rises. In 1721, the war with Sweden finally ends with the Treaty of Nystad, confirming Russia's dominance in the Baltic. The Senate awards Peter the titles that history will remember: Father of the Fatherland, Emperor of all Russia. The country he inherited as a backward, landlocked tsardom has become an empire, a power that Europe must reckon with. But the emperor is tired. The giant is slowing. The restless energy that drove him for decades has begun to flicker. He suffers from urinary problems, the legacy of a lifetime of hard living and untreated illnesses. He ignores the pain, as he has ignored everything that stood in his way, but the pain does not ignore him. In November 1724, he sees a ship run aground near Lahti on the Gulf of Finland. Soldiers and sailors are struggling in the freezing water, trying to save the crew. Without hesitation, Peter wades into the shallows, up to his waist in the Baltic winter, helping to pull the drowning men to safety. It is an act of reckless courage, the kind that defined his life, but it is also the act that will kill him. The cold water seeps into his already weakened body. Infection sets in. By January 1725, he is bedridden, delirious with fever, his giant frame reduced to a trembling husk. He tries to write his will, to name a successor, but his hand will not obey. He scrawls a few words: give everything to. Then the pen falls from his fingers. On January 28, 1725, Peter the Great dies. He is 52 years old. He leaves behind an empire, a city, a navy, a transformed country. He also leaves behind a succession crisis, a murdered son, and a dynasty balanced on a knife's edge. The shadow he cast was long enough to cover a continent, but in the moment of his death, that shadow lifts, and Russia must learn to see in a new light. The death of Peter the Great plunges Russia into a chaos he spent his life trying to prevent. He built an empire, but he forgot to build a system for passing it on. The old rules of succession, based on blood and birth, were shattered by his own hand when he murdered his son. The new rules, based on the will of the sovereign, died with him on that January bed, trapped in the unfinished sentence, give everything to. Give everything to whom? To his wife Catherine, the former servant girl who shared his throne and his hardships. To his grandson, the son of the murdered Alexei, a boy who carries his father's gentle eyes and his grandfather's name. To his daughters, Anna and Elizabeth, products of his second marriage, raised in the new world he created. The question has no answer, and in the absence of answer, the guards decide. The Preobrazhensky regiment, the same play soldiers who marched with Peter in his youth, now hold the power of kings. They gather outside the palace, their muskets ready, their loyalty fixed on the woman who shared their sovereign's bed and his campaigns. Catherine has won them not with policy but with presence. She drank with them, swore with them, nursed their wounds on the march. When the great men of the court hesitate, the guards act. They proclaim Catherine Empress Autocrat of all Russia. It is a moment that would have horrified the old Peter, the throne decided by common soldiers, by the very mob he spent his life taming. But the new Peter is dead, and his shadow cannot reach this far. Catherine I reigns for only 2 years. She is a placeholder, a bridge between the age of giants and whatever comes next. Real power rests with Menshikov, Peter's closest friend, the son of a paiseller who rose to become the most powerful man in Russia. He rules from behind the throne, enriching himself, scheming against rivals, preparing for the day when Catherine's fragile health finally fails. When that day comes in 1727, Menshikov acts quickly. He elevates Peter II, the murdered Alexei's son, to the throne. The boy is 11 years old, the last male Romanov, the hope of those who dream of a return to the old ways. For a moment, it seems the dynasty might stabilize. Menshikov betroths his own daughter to the young Tsar, positioning himself as father-in-law to the emperor. But the old ways have teeth. The Dolgorukovs, an ancient boyar family, resent Menshikov's rise. They whisper to the young Tsar, filling his ears with suspicions, turning him against the man who placed him on the throne. Within months, Menshikov is arrested, stripped of his honors, exiled to Siberia. The paiseller's son dies in the frozen wasteland he once ruled from afar. Peter II does not long survive his mentor. In 1730, just days before his planned wedding, he catches smallpox and dies. He is 14 years old. The male line of the Romanovs, the direct descendants of that frightened boy in the monastery cell, is extinguished. Dynasty should end here. By every rule of hereditary monarchy, the crown should pass to strangers, to distant cousins, to the end of the Romanov name. But Russia has never followed rules. The Supreme Privy Council, the body of nobles who now govern in the absence of a Tsar, looks for a compromise. They find it in Anna, daughter of Peter's half-brother Ivan, the same Ivan who shared the throne in those bloody years of childhood. She is a widow living in Kurland, forgotten by the world. She is perfect. The council offers Anna the throne on conditions. She must sign articles limiting her power. She must rule with their consent. She must not marry, not name an heir, not make war or peace without their approval. They want a figurehead, not an autocrat. They want to undo everything Peter built. Anna signs. She accepts every condition. Then she travels to Moscow, enters the Kremlin, and tears the articles to pieces before their eyes. The councilmen watch in horror as the guards surround them, as the woman they thought a puppet reveals herself as a predator. Anna has learned from Peter's example. She knows that power is not given, it is taken, and once taken, it must be held with a grip of iron. Her reign is a decade of darkness. She surrounds herself with Baltic Germans, men who share her language and her ruthlessness. Bayan, her favorite, becomes the real power in the land, a man so hated that his name will forever be linked with corruption and cruelty. The secret police flourish. Exiles fill the roads to Siberia. The old Russian families watch their influence vanish, replaced by foreigners who care nothing for tradition. Anna rules for 10 years. then dies in 1740, naming as her heir an infant, Ivan VI, great-grandson of Ivan V, a baby who will never know freedom. The child's reign lasts barely a year. In 1741, Peter's daughter Elizabeth makes her move. She walks into the Preobrazhensky barracks in the middle of the night, wearing a guardsman's uniform, a crucifix in one hand and a sword in the other. "My friends," she says to the soldiers, "you know whose daughter I am. Follow me." They follow, of course they follow. She is Peter's blood, Peter's shadow, the last living echo of the giant who built their regiment. The coup is bloodless. The baby emperor is taken, imprisoned, hidden away in a fortress where he will spend the next 23 years before being murdered by his jailers. Elizabeth ascends the throne, and Russia exhales. Her reign is a paradox. She is lazy, pleasure-loving, more interested in dresses than decrees. She owns 15,000 gowns, many of them never worn. She sleeps during the day and parties at night, leaving government to her ministers. But those ministers are competent, and Elizabeth has inherited her father's instinct for picking the right people. Under her indolent gaze, Russia fights wars, expands territories, founds Moscow University, and builds palaces that rival anything in Europe. She also makes one decision that will shape the dynasty's future. She summons her nephew from Germany, a Holstein prince named Karl Peter Ulrich, the son of her dead sister. He is the only living descendant of Peter the Great, the last carrier of the blood. She brings him to Russia, converts him to Orthodoxy, renames him Peter, and announces him as her heir. The boy is 14 years old. He is nervous, sickly, and deeply confused. He has been raised Lutheran, taught to despise everything Russian. Now he is told that he is the future emperor of this vast, strange land. He does not want to be here. He wants to go home, but home is gone, and Russia is all that remains. He looks out at the frozen Neva, at the city his grandfather built on bones, and shudders. The shadow of Peter the Great falls across him, cold and inescapable. He does not know that he will spend his entire life trying to escape it. He does not know that his failure to escape will cost him everything. The reformer is dead, but his shadow lives on, reaching across generations, shaping the lives of those who never knew him. It will reach further still, into the golden age to come, into the hands of a German princess who will learn to wield it better than any Romanov before her. But that story is yet to begin. Chapter 3: The Golden Century. She arrives in Russia as a German princess with empty pockets and a full mind. Her name is Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst, a mouthful of syllables from a principality so small it barely registers on maps. She is 14 years old, thin, intelligent, and utterly alone. The troika that carries her through the winter landscape rattles her bones and freezes her breath, but it does not freeze her ambition. She looks out at the snow-covered pines, at the peasants in their furs, at the golden domes of churches rising in the distance, and she makes a decision. She will become more Russian than the Russians. The year is 1744. Elizabeth reigns, resplendent in her silks, and she has chosen this German girl as a bride for her nephew, the heir Peter. The choice is not romantic, it is political. The Prussian king recommended her. The Romanov blood needs fresh infusion, and Sophia is young, healthy, and malleable, or so they think. They do not know what they are getting. From her first days in St. Petersburg, Sophia studies. She rises before dawn to learn Russian, padding barefoot through the cold rooms, memorizing vocabulary while her maid sleeps. She converts to Orthodoxy with a fervor that shocks the priests, reciting the creed in flawless Slavonic, her voice steady, her eyes bright. At her baptism, she takes a new name, Ekaterina or Catherine. She is no longer a German princess. She is a Russian Grand Duchess. Her husband is another matter. Peter is everything she is not. Awkward, childish, cruel in small ways, obsessed with his tiny German principality and the soldiers he drills like toys. He plays with dolls dressed as officers. He admires the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, as a god. He tells Catherine on their wedding night that he does not love her, that he loves another woman, that this marriage is a prison. He then falls asleep, leaving her alone in the vast, cold bed. The marriage is a farce that lasts 17 years. Peter ignores her, humiliates her, flaunts his mistresses. Catherine endures. She has no choice. Divorce would mean exile, separation from her son Paul, born after years of desperate loneliness. She fills the emptiness with books, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Tacitus, devouring the ideas of the Enlightenment as hungrily as she once devoured the Russian language. She reads herself into a new identity, a philosophy of power that will guide her for the rest of her life. While Peter plays with his toy soldiers, Catherine cultivates friends. She charms the courtiers, the guards, the priests. She learns who to trust and who to avoid. She builds a network of alliances that spans the palace, the city, the empire. She waits. In 1761, Elizabeth dies. Peter ascends the throne as Peter III and immediately sets about destroying himself. He ends Russia's war with Prussia, returning conquered territory to Frederick the Great, whom he idolizes. He alienates the church by threatening to seize its lands. He insults the guards by forcing them to wear Prussian uniforms and drill in the Prussian style. In 6 months, he makes himself the most hated man in Russia. Catherine watches, she calculates, she waits. On the night of June 28, 1762, she acts. A messenger wakes her in the Peterhof Palace, whispering that one of her co-conspirators has been arrested, that the plot is in danger of unraveling. Catherine dresses quickly and rides to St. Petersburg, arriving at the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment. She steps from the carriage, her dark hair loose, her eyes steady. The soldiers surround her. For a moment, no one speaks. Then a priest steps forward and proclaims her empress autocrat of all Russia. The soldiers kneel. The coup has begun. Peter, meanwhile, is at Oranienbaum, his palace on the Gulf of Finland, oblivious. When news reaches him, he panics. He sends messages, issues orders, tries to rally support. But no one comes. No one will fight for him. Within days, he abdicates. Within a week, he is dead, murdered by guards while in custody, probably with Catherine's knowledge, certainly with her consent. The German princess has become empress. She is 33 years old. She has no claim to the throne by blood, no right by law, nothing but her intelligence, her ambition, and the loyalty of the men who put her there. It is enough. It will always be enough. But as she settles into the Winter Palace, as the courtiers bow and the ambassadors congratulate, she looks out the window at the Neva, frozen and silent, and she thinks of the shadow that hangs over this city. She is not a Romanov by birth. She is not Peter the Great's descendant, but she will be his heir. She will rule as he ruled, absolutely, ruthlessly, magnificently. She will drag Russia further into the light of the Enlightenment, even as she chains her people ever more tightly to the darkness of serfdom. The golden century has begun, and its empress is just getting started. The first years of Catherine's reign are a tightrope walk over an abyss. She is an usurper, a foreigner, a woman in a world that believes power belongs to men. Her son, Paul, is the legitimate heir, and there are those who whisper that she should rule only as regent until he comes of age. Her husband's murder hangs over her like a ghost, unspoken but never forgotten. The guards who put her on the throne could just as easily remove her. She meets these challenges with the only weapons she has: charm, intelligence, and an iron will that she hides beneath a mask of serene confidence. She works 18-hour days, reading reports, meeting with ministers, learning the machinery of government, until she understands it better than the men who have spent their lives inside it. She writes letters to Voltaire and Diderot, the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, cultivating an image of herself as a philosopher queen, a ruler who governs by reason rather than force. But force is never far beneath the surface. In 1764, just 2 years into her reign, a young officer named Morovich tries to free the imprisoned Ivan VI, the infant emperor who was overthrown by Elizabeth. The plot fails. Ivan, now 23 years old, is murdered by his guards to prevent his rescue. Catherine expresses horror, but she does not punish the killers. She understands, as all autocrats must, that some deaths are necessary. Ivan was a threat as long as he lived. Now he is a threat no longer. The pattern of her reign is set. She will rule with an enlightened hand, but that hand will never hesitate to close into a fist. In 1767, she convenes a legislative commission, a gathering of deputies from across Russia, nobles, townspeople, even some state peasants, to draft a new law code. She writes instruction for them, a document filled with the ideas of Montesquieu and Beccaria, advocating for reforms that would limit torture, guarantee due process, and create a more just society. The deputies are dazzled. Europe is impressed. Catherine poses as the most progressive monarch of her age. But when the deputies begin to debate the question of serfdom, the institution that binds millions of Russians to the land as property, the mask slips. The nobles refuse to consider any limitation on their power over their peasants. Catherine, who depends on the nobles for her throne, backs down. The commission is dissolved, its work unfinished. Serfdom will continue, unchallenged, unaltered, a festering wound at the heart of the empire. The contradiction defines her. She reads Voltaire and believes in human dignity, but she also accepts that her power rests on the backs of enslaved millions. She dreams of a Russia governed by law, but she rules as an autocrat, her will the only law that matters. She is a child of the Enlightenment, trapped in the body of an empress, and the two halves of her soul can never be reconciled. While she wrestles with philosophy, the empire itself is changing. The borders expand with terrifying speed. In 1768, war with the Ottoman Empire begins, the first of many conflicts that will push Russia's frontiers south and west. Russian armies sweep into the Crimea, the Black Sea steppes, the Danubian principalities. The Ottoman navy is destroyed at Chesme. The Russian flag flies over waters that have been Muslim for centuries. The war brings glory, but it also brings plague. In 1771, bubonic plague sweeps through Moscow, killing thousands each day. The governor flees, the mob riots, the archbishop is murdered in the Kremlin. Catherine, hundreds of miles away in St. Petersburg, watches the dispatches with growing alarm. She sends her most trusted general, Grigory Orlov, one of the men who helped her seize the throne, to restore order. Orlov does so with characteristic efficiency, imposing quarantines, distributing money, calming the mob. The plague recedes, but the cracks in the empire's facade are growing wider. In 1773, those cracks become a chasm. A Cossack named Emelian Pugachev, claiming to be the murdered Peter III, raises the banner of rebellion in the Ural Mountains. His army swells with serfs, old believers, runaway soldiers, and Cossacks who resent Moscow's growing control. He promises freedom, land, the end of noble oppression. Thousands flock to his standard. The rebellion spreads like wildfire across the Volga region, consuming estates, murdering nobles, burning cities. Catherine watches in horror as the largest peasant revolt in Russian history threatens to tear her empire apart. For months, Pugachev's forces evade capture, winning battles, inspiring terror. The nobility, whose support Catherine needs, demand blood. They get it. In 1774, the tide turns. Government forces finally corner Pugachev, crush his army, and capture the pretender. He is brought to Moscow in an iron cage, displayed to the crowds who once cheered him, and then executed in Bolotnaya Square. His head is cut off, his body quartered, his remains displayed as a warning to any who would follow his path. Catherine learns the lesson well. Enlightenment is for philosophers. For peasants, there is only the knout and the gallows. She will never again flirt with reform that threatens the social order. The fist will remain closed. Yet even as she crushes rebellion, she builds. The victories over the Ottomans culminate in the Treaty of Kuchak-Kainaji in 1774, which gives Russia a foothold on the Black Sea and, more importantly, the right to intervene in the Ottoman Empire on behalf of Orthodox Christians. It is a diplomatic triumph that positions Russia as the protector of orthodoxy, a role that will shape foreign policy for centuries. And in the newly conquered lands, she plants the seeds of a dream. She invites Greek settlers to the Crimea, renames cities with classical names, and imagines a new Byzantine empire rising from the ashes of the old. Her second grandson is named Constantine, destined, she hopes, to rule a restored Greek kingdom from Constantinople itself. The dream will never be realized, but the ambition behind it reveals the scale of her imagination. She is not merely ruling an empire, she is building one. The men who help Catherine build are as remarkable as she is. They come from nowhere, rise to everything, and fall just as quickly when their usefulness ends. She collects lovers like some collect art, but each relationship is more than pleasure, it is policy. The men who share her bed also share her power, and she chooses them with the same care she applies to choosing generals and ambassadors. Grigory Potemkin is the greatest of them. He appears at court in the early 1770s, a giant of a man with one eye and a mind as vast as the empire he will help create. He is crude, brilliant, loyal, and utterly unpredictable. Catherine falls for him completely, not just physically but intellectually. He is the only man who can match her vision, who understands that Russia's future lies in the south, in the Black Sea steppes, in the conquest of nature itself. Their affair burns hot for 2 years, then cools into something deeper, a partnership that will shape the rest of her reign. Potemkin becomes her co-ruler in all but name, the man who turns her dreams into reality. He builds cities, Kherson, Nikolaev, Yekaterinburg, from nothing, planting civilization in the wilderness. He creates the Black Sea Fleet, conjuring ships from timber and canvas and the labor of thousands. He conquers the Crimea in 1783, finally fulfilling the dream that began with Peter the Great. Russia rules the northern shores of the Black Sea. Catherine is ecstatic. She writes to her European correspondents, boasting of her triumphs, painting herself as a new Semiramis, a queen of the East. In 1787, she undertakes a grand journey to the new territories, traveling down the Dnieper River in a fleet of gilded barges, accompanied by foreign ambassadors and Austrian Emperor Joseph II. Potemkin stages the journey with theatrical genius, creating the famous Potemkin villages, facades of prosperity designed to impress the visitors. The phrase will become a term for political deception, but on the river that summer, it works. The foreigners are dazzled. Catherine is delighted. The empire seems unstoppable. But even as the barges glide south, the shadows gather. The Ottoman Empire, humiliated by its losses, declares war again in 1787. Sweden, seeing Russia distracted, attacks from the north in 1788. Catherine faces a two-front war, the kind that has broken empires before. Potemkin rushes to the south, organizing defenses, leading armies, dying slowly from the fevers that plagued the steppes. In 1791, he collapses on the road to Yassy, his giant frame finally giving out. Catherine receives the news in St. Petersburg and weeps openly, something she rarely allows herself to do. He was more than a lover. He was her mirror, her partner, the only man who truly understood what she was trying to build. Without him, the wars grind on. Russia prevails, as Russia always does, but the cost is mounting. The empire expands, but the expansion brings new problems: restless populations, hostile neighbors, and armies stretched too thin. Catherine, now in her 60s, grows tired. The energy that once drove her to 18-hour days now flags. She retreats into the company of younger men, Zubov, the last of her favorites, a handsome nonentity who feeds her vanity and isolates her from reality. The French Revolution erupts in 1789, sending shockwaves across Europe. Catherine watches with horror as the monarchy falls, as the king is executed, as the mob rules the streets of Paris. The enlightened philosopher queen who once corresponded with Voltaire now sees where enlightenment leads. She becomes a reactionary, censoring books, imprisoning radicals, turning her back on the ideas that shaped her youth. The contradiction at the heart of her reign finally consumes her. In Poland, the revolution inspires a movement for reform. The Polish king, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, once Catherine's lover, placed on the throne by her hand, attempts to create a modern constitution to free his country from Russian domination. Catherine will not permit it. In 1793 and 1795, Russian armies sweep through Poland, crushing the reform movement, partitioning the kingdom out of existence. Poland vanishes from the map, erased by the very woman who once dreamed of enlightenment. The partitions bring vast territories and millions of new subjects into the empire, but they also bring hatred, resentment, a wound that will never heal. The Poles will remember. They will rise again, again, each rebellion crushed with greater brutality, each failure deepening the chasm between ruler and ruled. Catherine does not see this. She sees only the map, the borders expanding, the empire growing. She has become what she once despised, a tyrant, blind to the suffering beneath her feet. In November 1796, she suffers a stroke in her bathing room. Her servants find her on the floor, unconscious, her face twisted. They carry her to bed, where she lies for 2 days, unable to speak, unable to move, her breath rattling in her throat. On November 6, she dies. The court is silent, the empire holds its breath, and in the shadows her son waits. Paul has spent 34 years in his mother's shadow, watching her take the throne that should have been his, watching her surround herself with lovers and favorites, watching her build an empire while he built nothing but resentment. He is 42 years old, strange, unstable, filled with a lifetime of suppressed rage. Now, finally, he is emperor. The golden century is over. The silver age that follows will be brief, dark, and violent. Paul ascends the throne with a lifetime of grievances burning in his chest. He is 42 years old, but he looks older, his face pinched, his eyes darting, his movements jerky and unpredictable. The courtiers who bow before him see a stranger. They have spent decades ignoring him, dismissing him, treating him as an irrelevance. Now he holds their lives in his hands. His first act is to exhume his father. Peter III, murdered 34 years ago, lies in a grave at the Alexandra Nevsky monastery, forgotten by all but his son. Paul orders the body disinterred, dressed in imperial regalia, and placed beside Catherine's in the Peter and Paul Cathedral. The message is unmistakable. The usurper and the usurped will lie together for eternity. Paul is declaring, in the most dramatic way possible, that his mother's reign was a crime and that justice has finally come. The court shudders. The foreign ambassadors write frantic dispatches, but Paul is just beginning. He hates everything Catherine loved. He hates her friends, her lovers, her advisors, her policies. He hates the Enlightenment, the philosophers, the very idea of progress. He believes in order, discipline, hierarchy, the old ways, the Prussian ways, the ways of his murdered father. He imposes a new dress code on the army, forcing officers to wear Prussian uniforms and wigs. He drills the guards relentlessly, punishing the slightest infraction with exile or imprisonment. He bans words he finds offensive: revolution, enlightenment, citizen, from public discourse. He creates a secret police force to root out dissent. The nobles, accustomed to the freedoms of Catherine's reign, find themselves living in a police state. They cannot travel without permission. They cannot publish without censorship. They cannot even choose their own clothes. Paul dictates everything, down to the shape of hats and the length of coats. His decrees pour forth in a torrent, each one more arbitrary than the last, each one creating new enemies. He is not entirely wrong in his suspicions. The French Revolution has terrified every throne in Europe. The ideas of liberty and equality are spreading like a contagion. Paul sees conspiracy everywhere, and in some cases, he is right to see it. But his response is so extreme, so irrational, that it creates the very conspiracies he fears. In foreign policy, he veers wildly. He allies with Austria and England against revolutionary France, sending Russian armies into Italy and Switzerland. But when his allies fail to support him adequately, he switches sides. He befriends Napoleon, the man who embodies everything he claims to hate, and plots an invasion of British India. The plan is mad, marching Russian Cossacks across Central Asia without supplies, without maps, without any chance of success, but Paul orders it anyway. 20,000 Cossacks set out into the unknown, riding toward a death they will only narrowly avoid when Paul's own death recalls them. At home, his paranoia deepens. He suspects his own family of plotting against him. His sons, Alexander and Constantine, live in fear of his rages. His wife, Maria, treads carefully around his moods. The palace becomes a prison, its inhabitants watching every word, every gesture, terrified of triggering the emperor's wrath. In 1801, the conspiracy finally forms. It is led by Count von der Pahlen, the military governor of St. Petersburg, and includes some of the most powerful men in Russia, nobles, generals, even members of the imperial family. They do not act out of love for liberty. They act out of fear. Paul has become unpredictable, dangerous, a threat to their lives and to the stability of the empire. He must be removed. On the night of March 23, the conspirators move. They enter the Mikhailovsky castle, Paul's newly built fortress, a paranoid's dream of moats and secret passages. The guards, many of them in on the plot, do not resist. The conspirators climb the stairs, push through the doors, and find Paul cowering behind a screen. What happens next is confused by conflicting accounts. Some say Paul was offered abdication and refused. Some say he was struck down immediately. Some say he fought back, a small man against a mob, his screams echoing through the stone corridors. What is certain is that he died, strangled, beaten, crushed by the weight of men who had had enough. When it is over, the conspirators emerge, pale and shaking. They go to Alexander, Paul's eldest son, and tell him that his father is dead. Alexander, who knew of the plot but believed it would stop at abdication, is horrified. He weeps. He rages. He refuses to believe, but the deed is done, and he is now emperor. The news spreads through St. Petersburg with the dawn. The people, long oppressed by Paul's tyranny, do not mourn. They celebrate. The nobles breathe sighs of relief. The guards return to their barracks. The Cossacks, marching toward India, are recalled before they can die in the desert. Paul's body lies in state in the Mikhailovsky castle, the fortress he built to protect himself from the very fate that found him there. The courtiers file past, their faces masks of grief, their hearts light with freedom. They have killed an emperor, and they will never be punished for it. Alexander, too weak or too complicit, will let them go free. The golden century ended with Catherine. The silver age that followed lasted 5 years. Now a new century begins, and with it, a new emperor, young, handsome, idealistic, haunted by the blood on his hands. Alexander I ascends the throne, and Russia holds its breath. The blood of his father is on his hands before he ever wears the crown. Alexander begins his reign haunted, and history will haunt him in return. He is born into light, but he will die in shadow. Alexander Pavlovich Romanov enters the world on December 23, 1777, in the Winter Palace, the same gilded cage that has held his family for generations. His grandmother, Catherine the Great, takes immediate possession of him. She has waited years for this moment, a male heir, a new hope, a child she can mold into the enlightened ruler she once dreamed of becoming. She whisks him away from his parents, installing him in her own apartments, surrounding him with tutors who fill his head with the ideas of Rousseau and Locke, with visions of a Russia governed by reason and justice. He is a beautiful child, golden-haired and gentle-eyed, and Catherine dotes on him. She writes letters to her philosopher friends, boasting of his progress, his intelligence, his charm. She calls him our republic and dreams of the day he will ascend the throne and complete the work she began. But Alexander learns early to wear masks. He learns to smile at his grandmother while longing for his mother. He learns to recite the lessons of the Enlightenment while watching his grandmother crush rebellion and tighten the chains of serfdom. He learns that power is a performance, that the man who rules must hide the man who feels. His father, Paul, watches from a distance, nursing his own resentments. He sees Catherine's preference for Alexander as another theft, another humiliation. When he finally becomes emperor in 1796, he subjects his son to a different kind of education, military drills, Prussian discipline, the harsh regimen of a barracks. Alexander learns to salute and obey, to hide his thoughts behind a mask of submission. He becomes an expert at survival. And then, on that March night in 1801, survival requires him to become a murderer. He knew of the plot. He told himself it was necessary, that his father's madness threatened the empire, that abdication would be enough. But when the conspirators came to him in the early morning, their faces pale, their hands shaking, and told him that Paul was dead, not deposed, not imprisoned, but dead, strangled in his own bedroom, Alexander collapsed. He wept. He raged at the men who had done this. He cried out that he had never wanted it, never asked for it, never imagined it would come to this. But he had known, and knowing made him complicit. The guilt will never leave him. It will shape every decision, every reform, every retreat. He will spend his entire reign trying to atone for a sin he can never undo. The new emperor is 23 years old. He is tall, handsome, graceful, everything a Tsar should be. The courtiers who bow before him see a young god, a new dawn after the darkness of Paul's tyranny. They do not see the weight he carries, the ghosts that whisper in his ear, the fear that he will share his father's fate. His friends are young, idealistic, filled with the same Enlightenment dreams that shaped his childhood. They call themselves the unofficial committee, and they meet in secret to plan the transformation of Russia. They dream of a constitution, of limits on autocratic power, of freeing the serfs, of creating a society where law rules instead of men. Alexander listens, encourages, approves. He creates ministries, reforms education, eases censorship. He talks constantly of reform, of progress, of the new Russia they will build together. But he does nothing fundamental. The serfs remain enslaved. The autocracy remains absolute. The constitution he promises never materializes. Whenever reform threatens the interests of the nobles who put him on the throne, Alexander retreats. He has seen what happens to Tsars who push too hard. His father's corpse is still fresh in his memory. The mask he learned to wear as a child becomes his permanent face. He smiles at reformers while reassuring conservatives. He talks of liberty while maintaining tyranny. He dreams of one Russia while ruling another. The gap between his ideals and his actions widens until it becomes an abyss. In 1807, the abyss swallows him. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, has crushed the Prussian army and stands on Russia's frontier. Alexander meets him at Tilsit, on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The two emperors embrace, exchange gifts, and divide the world between them. Alexander becomes Napoleon's ally, joining the continental system against England, accepting the French domination of Europe. For the Russian court, it is a humiliation. For Alexander, it is a necessity. He needs time, he needs peace. He needs to rebuild his army, his economy, his confidence. He smiles at Napoleon and plans his revenge. But the alliance costs him dearly. The continental system strangles Russian trade. The nobles, who depend on selling grain to England, grow restive. The economy teeters. And Napoleon, never satisfied, continues to expand, to demand more, to treat Alexander as a junior partner rather than an equal. By 1810, the alliance is crumbling. Alexander begins to prepare for the war he knows is coming. He rebuilds his army, stockpiles supplies, fortifies cities. He sends spies into French-occupied Europe. He waits. In June 1812, Napoleon stops waiting. He crosses the Niemen with the largest army Europe has ever seen, more than 500,000 men, drawn from every corner of his empire. They march toward Moscow, singing songs of glory, dreaming of conquest. Alexander receives the news in a ballroom in Vilnius. He dances while his aides whisper in his ear. He does not flee. He does not panic. He sends a message to Napoleon: "I will not be the first to draw my sword, but I will be the last to sheath it." The war has begun, and Alexander, the haunted son of a murdered father, is about to become the savior of Europe. Chapter 4: The Last Tsar. He is the most powerful man in the world, and he has never wanted to be. Nicholas II ascends the throne in November 1894, and his first act is to marry the woman he loves. Alexandra of Hesse is German, English by upbringing, granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She is beautiful, shy, intense, and deeply, almost pathologically, unwelcome in Russia. The courtiers whisper that she is cold. The people resent her German blood. The Grand Dukes, those vast collections of Romanov cousins, circle her like wolves. Nicholas does not care. He loves her with a devotion that will define his reign and destroy his dynasty. She is his strength, his weakness, his everything. The coronation takes place in May 1896 in the ancient Dormition Cathedral in Moscow, the same cathedral where Mikhail Romanov was crowned nearly 3 centuries before. Nicholas processes through the streets in golden robes, his young wife beside him, the crowds cheering, the bells ringing. It is the most magnificent day of his life. It is also the most tragic. The celebrations include a festival at Kodinka Field, a vast plain outside Moscow where free food and drink are promised to the people. The crowd is enormous, 500,000, perhaps more. The field is uneven, riddled with ditches from old excavations. The distribution points are too few. When the rumors spread that supplies are running low, the crowd surges forward. Thousands are trampled. Men, women, children fall into the ditches and are crushed by the mass behind them. Bodies pile up, suffocating those beneath. When it is over, nearly 1,400 people are dead and thousands more are injured. Nicholas learns of the disaster that night. His advisors urge him to cancel the coronation ball, to show grief, to connect with his people. But the French ambassador has spent a fortune on the ball, and diplomacy demands its continuation. Nicholas hesitates. Alexandra, sheltered and inexperienced, defers to the advisors. The ball proceeds. The Tsar dances while his people lie in morgues. The image will never leave him. It will never leave Russia. The new reign begins under a curse. The people who cheered him now whisper that he is cold, heartless, indifferent to suffering. The radicals, already plotting revolution, use Kodinka as proof that the autocracy must fall. Nicholas, who wanted only to be loved, has already failed. In the years that follow, he tries to rule as his father ruled, firmly, autocratically, without compromise. But he lacks his father's iron. He is gentle where he should be hard, indecisive where he should be certain. He consults endlessly, weighing opinions, seeking consensus, finding none. The ministers, accustomed to being commanded, grow frustrated with his hesitation. The court, always a nest of intrigue, becomes a snake pit. Alexandra gives him daughters, 4 of them, beautiful and healthy, but not the son the dynasty needs. The lack of an heir becomes an obsession, a wound, a source of endless anxiety. Alexandra prays, consults doctors, tries every treatment Russia and Europe can offer. Nothing works. In 1904, finally, a son is born. They name him Alexei, after the beloved Tsar of the 17th century, after the murdered son of Peter the Great. The dynasty has its heir. But the child is not healthy. Within weeks, they discover the truth. Alexei has hemophilia, the royal disease, the curse of the European houses. His blood will not clot. A bruise can kill him. A bump can bleed for days. He lives in a bubble of cotton and cushions, watched constantly, protected desperately, always one fall away from death. Nicholas and Alexandra are devastated. The son they prayed for is a fragile flame that any wind could extinguish. They hide his condition from the world, but the secret leaks out, becomes rumor, becomes legend. The Tsarevich is sick. The dynasty is weak. The future is uncertain. And into that uncertainty steps a man who will change everything. His name is Grigory Rasputin. He appears first as a rumor, then as a photograph, then as a presence in the palace. Grigory Rasputin is a Siberian peasant, a wanderer, a starets, a holy man of the Russian tradition, marked by God and madness in equal measure. His eyes are pale, piercing, hypnotic. His beard is long, his hair unkempt, his clothes those of a simple pilgrim. He smells of sweat and smoke and the open road. Alexandra meets him in 1905, brought to the palace by her closest friend, a Montenegrin princess who has fallen under his spell. The Tsarevich is bleeding again, a minor injury that has become a crisis, the boy's legs swelling, his temperature rising, the doctors helpless. Rasputin prays. He lays his hands on the child. He speaks in his rough peasant voice, promising that the bleeding will stop. It does. The doctors cannot explain it. Perhaps it is autosuggestion, the power of calm in a house of panic. Perhaps it is something else, something beyond medicine, beyond reason. Alexandra does not care about explanations. She cares about results. Her son is alive. The holy man saved him. She will never doubt him again. From that moment, Rasputin's place is secure. He becomes the confidant of the empress, the healer of the Tsarevich, the shadow behind the throne. He comes and goes as he pleases, admitted to the family's private apartments, present at moments of crisis, always calm, always certain, always promising that as long as he lives, the boy will live. The court watches with horror. Who is this peasant, this debauched mystic, this man who smells of the stables to stand so close to the Tsar? The rumors spread like fire. Rasputin is a spy. Rasputin is a German agent. Rasputin is the lover of the empress, the father of her children, the Antichrist in peasant's clothing. None of it is true, but truth has never mattered in palace gossip. The whispers grow louder, more insistent, more damaging. Nicholas sees the problem but cannot solve it. He trusts his wife. He loves his son. If Rasputin helps Alexei, then Rasputin must stay. The alternative, watching his boy die, is unthinkable. He allows the situation to continue, hoping it will somehow resolve itself, hoping the storm will pass. It does not pass, it builds. In 1914, the storm breaks over all of Europe. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. The alliances trigger. The armies mobilize. Germany declares war on Russia. Nicholas, who has spent his reign avoiding conflict, now leads his empire into the greatest war the world has ever seen. At first, the war unites Russia. The crowds gather outside the Winter Palace, cheering, waving flags, singing hymns. Nicholas appears on the balcony, and the people kneel. The old divisions, Tsar and subject, noble and peasant, rich and poor, seem to dissolve in the flood of patriotism. Even the revolutionaries pause, uncertain whether to oppose a war that the people support. Nicholas visits the front, wearing a simple uniform, reviewing troops, blessing icons. He believes that God has sent this trial to purify Russia, to unite the Tsar and people, to fulfill the ancient dream of Holy Russia. He does not see the cracks beneath his feet. The cracks widen with every month of war. The German army is better equipped, better trained, better led. Russian soldiers march into battle with rifles but no ammunition, with courage but no supplies, with faith but no hope. The casualties are staggering, millions dead, wounded, captured. The refugees flood the cities, spreading disease and despair. On the home front, the economy crumbles. The railways, already strained, cannot move both troops and supplies. The cities run short of food, of fuel, of everything. The prices rise. The queues lengthen. The patience of the people, stretched thin by years of hardship, begins to snap. And Rasputin remains. While soldiers die in the trenches, the holy man dances in the palaces. While children starve in the cities, the empress writes him letters filled with devotion. The rumors, already poisonous, become lethal. The Tsarina is a traitor. The Tsar is a puppet. The government is run by Germans and peasants and madmen. Nicholas, increasingly isolated, makes a fatal decision. In 1915, he leaves St. Petersburg for the front, taking personal command of the army. He believes that his presence will inspire the troops, that his leadership will turn the tide. In reality, he abandons the capital to his wife, and his wife abandons it to Rasputin. Alexandra rules through a succession of incompetent ministers, each one chosen on Rasputin's advice, each one more disastrous than the last. The government lurches from crisis to crisis. The Duma, the elected assembly that Nicholas has always distrusted, grows increasingly hostile. The generals, watching the chaos from the front, begin to whisper of alternatives. By the end of 1916, Russia is a powder keg. The soldiers are mutinous, the workers are striking, the nobles are plotting, and in the palace, a small group of conspirators decides that Rasputin must die. On the night of December 29, they lure him to the Yusupov Palace, a glittering mansion on the Moika Canal. They feed him cakes laced with cyanide. He eats them without effect. They give him wine laced with more poison. He drinks and laughs. Finally, in desperation, Prince Felix Yusupov shoots him in the back. Rasputin falls. The conspirators gather around, believing it is over. Then his eyes open. He lunges at Yusupov, clawing at his throat, screaming. The others shoot again. He falls once more. They beat him, kick him, wrap him in a curtain, and throw him through a hole in the ice into the frozen river. When his body is recovered 3 days later, the autopsy shows that he died not from poison, not from bullets, but from drowning. He was still alive when he hit the water. He fought to the end. Alexandra receives the news with a strange calm. She buries him secretly, praying at his grave, believing that his death signals her own. Nicholas, at the front, learns of the murder and does nothing. The killers are members of his own family, his own court. To punish them would be to acknowledge the rot at the heart of his reign. He lets them go. The rot does not go, it spreads. The new year, 1917, begins with snow and silence. But beneath the silence, the ground is shifting. In the factories of Petrograd, the German-sounding name given to St. Petersburg at the start of the war, the workers are gathering. They are hungry, they are angry, they are ready. The dynasty has 300 years behind it. It has only a few weeks left. February 1917. Petrograd is a city of snow and queues. The women stand for hours in the bitter cold, waiting for bread that never comes, for fuel that has already been burned, for news that might bring hope. Their men are at the front, or dead, or deserting. Their children are hungry. Their patience is exhausted. On February 23, International Women's Day, they take to the streets. It begins as a protest, women demanding bread, workers demanding wages, ordinary people demanding the right to survive. The banners are simple: bread, peace, down with the autocracy. The police watch, uncertain. The soldiers watch, remembering that these women are their mothers, their wives, their sisters. The next day the crowds grow, the next, larger still. The government orders the army to restore order. The soldiers refuse. They have seen enough of death. They will not kill their own people. On February 27, the mutiny spreads. Regiments pour out of their barracks, joining the crowds, seizing weapons, freeing prisoners. The arsenal falls. The prisons open. The city belongs to the revolution. Nicholas is at headquarters in Mogilov, hundreds of miles away, receiving reports that grow more alarming by the hour. He orders troops to march on the capital. He orders the Duma dissolved. He orders, and nothing happens. The troops he sends defect before they arrive. The Duma he dissolves refuses to disperse. The world he built is crumbling, and he can only watch. On March 2, the generals speak. They have supported him through 3 years of war, through incompetence and disaster, through Rasputin and ruin, but they will not support him now. They tell him gently at first, then firmly, that he must go. The army will not fight for him. The people will not obey him. The only way to save Russia, to save the dynasty, perhaps, is to abdicate. Nicholas sits in his railway carriage, the imperial train stalled on a siding near Pskov, and listens. His cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas, once commander of the armies, urges him to step down. His generals, one by one, add their voices. There is no one left to fight for him. There is no one left at all. He takes out a pencil and writes the manifesto. His hand shakes. The words come slowly. He abdicates not only for himself, but for his son, the boy he loves, the boy he has protected, the boy whose hemophilia would make him a prisoner of the revolution. He passes the crown to his brother, Michael. Michael refuses it the next day. The 300-year reign of the Romanovs is over. The family is placed under house arrest at the Alexandra Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. They are still comfortable, still together, still hopping. Alexandra writes in her diary that God will provide. Nicholas notes the spring weather and the soldiers who guard them. The children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, play in the gardens, pretending that nothing has changed. Everything has changed. The provisional government, which now rules Russia, does not know what to do with them. The revolutionaries demand blood. The moderates urge caution. The Allies worry about the Eastern Front. The Romanovs are moved from palace to palace, city to city, each step taking them further from the life they knew, closer to the fate they cannot see. In August 1917, they are sent to Tobolsk, a provincial town in Siberia. The journey takes weeks, the train crawling through a country in chaos. They arrive to find a governor's mansion, comfortable but cramped, guarded by soldiers who are friendly at first, then distant, then hostile. The winter comes, colder than any they have known. The children shovel snow. The Tsar reads aloud in the evenings. The empress knits and prays. In Petrograd, the provisional government falls. Lenin and the Bolsheviks seize power, promising peace, land, bread, and an end to the Romanovs. The civil war begins. The white armies, loyal to the old order, fight the red armies of the revolution. The Romanovs, stranded in Siberia, become pawns in a game they do not understand. In April 1918, a commissar arrives from Moscow. His name is Yakovlev, and he has orders to move the family again. Nicholas assumes they are going to Moscow to face trial, perhaps to be exiled. He hopes for the best. He always hopes for the best. The journey is a nightmare. The trains are packed, the roads are rough, the guards are brutal. Alexandra screams when they are separated from the children, reunited only after hours of terror. They travel through a country at war with itself, past burned villages and abandoned farms, past corpses hanging from trees and soldiers who stare with empty eyes. They do not go to Moscow. They go to Yekaterinburg, a factory town in the Urals, a stronghold of Bolshevik power. They are delivered to a house on Voznesensky Prospect, a merchant's house, 2 stories, surrounded by a high wooden fence. The man who receives them tells them it is the house of special purpose. They do not know that this house is their grave. The house on Voznesensky Prospect becomes their world. 78 days. 78 days of waiting, of hopping, of slowly understanding that no one is coming to save them. The Ipatiev House is not a palace. It is a merchant's home, 2 stories of provincial respectability, now transformed into a fortress. The windows are whitewashed, sealing out the world. The walls are topped with barbed wire. The guards patrol day and night, their boots crunching on the gravel, their voices carrying through the thin walls. The family is crowded into a few rooms on the upper floor. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and the Tsarevich Alex, 11 people in total, counting the retainers who have refused to abandon them. They sleep on camp beds, eat from tin plates, use a bathroom that has no privacy and never enough water. The guards mock them, call them names, scratch obscene drawings on the walls for them to find. Nicholas tries to maintain normalcy. He reads aloud in the evenings, Lermontov, Tolstoy, the Bible. He works in the garden, chopping wood, shoveling snow, grateful for any activity that tires his body and quiets his mind. He writes in his diary, the same careful handwriting he has used since childhood, recording the weather, the meals, the small events of their shrinking world. Alexandra sits by the window, staring at the whitewashed glass. She is ill now, her heart, her lungs, her spirit all failing. She prays constantly, her lips moving in the Orthodox prayers she adopted so fervently as a young bride. She writes letters to friends who will never receive them, asking for news, for hope, for some sign that God has not abandoned them. The children try to be children. Olga, the eldest, is 22, quiet and serious, her mother's confidant. Tatiana, 21, is the organizer, the caretaker, the one who nurses her brother and comforts her sisters. Maria, 19, is beautiful and gentle, dreaming of marriage and children that will never come. Anastasia, 17, is the clown, the comedian, doing impressions of the guards, making her sisters laugh in the darkness. And Alexei, 13, lies in his bed, his legs useless, his body bruised, his spirit unbroken despite everything. The guards change over the weeks. The first are relatively lenient, allowing the family some privacy, some dignity. They are replaced by harder men, Bolshevik loyalists who see the Romanovs as enemies of the people, vermin to be exterminated. The commandant, a man named Yekaterinburg, arrives in early July. He is efficient, cold, methodical. He inspects the house, inventories the possessions, tightens the rules. The family feels the noose constricting. Outside, the civil war rages. The White Army, loyal to the old order, is advancing on Yekaterinburg. The Czech Legion, fighting the Bolsheviks, is approaching from the east. The Reds know they cannot hold the city forever. They know that if the Romanovs are liberated, they will become a symbol, a rallying point, a threat to everything the revolution has fought for. Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership in Moscow send a secret message. No Romanovs must fall into white hands. The meaning is clear. The family must be eliminated before the city falls. Yurovsky receives the order on July 16. He prepares. That night the family goes to bed as usual. Nicholas writes in his diary, "We went to bed late, at about 11:30. The weather was warm and pleasant. Alexandra reads her prayers. The children settle into their camp beds. Outside, the guards take their positions. At midnight, Yurovsky wakes them. He tells them there is unrest in the city, that they must be moved to a safer location for their own protection. He tells them to dress quickly, to gather their things. The family obeys, as they have obeyed every order, every indignity, every step of the long journey from palace to prison. They are led down the stairs to the basement. It is a small room, perhaps 6 meters square, with a single electric bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls are striped with rough plaster. The floor is wooden. There is no furniture, no windows, no way out except the door through which they entered. Alexandra asks for chairs. Yurovsky sends for 2. She sits on one, Alexei in her lap. Nicholas stands behind them, his arm resting on his son's shoulder. The daughters stand behind their mother, clutching pillows, small bags, the pathetic remnants of their former lives. The retainers, the doctor, the cook, the maid, the valet, stand with them. Yurovsky returns with a squad of armed men. He tells the family to stand. They rise, confused, uncertain. He pulls a paper from his pocket and reads, "In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." Nicholas turns, his mouth opening to speak. What? The shooting begins. It is chaos. The room is small, the gunfire deafening, the smoke blinding. Nicholas falls first, struck by multiple bullets. Alexandra crosses herself and falls beside him. The children scream, but the screaming is drowned by the rifles. The room fills with blood and cordite and the cries of the dying. But the children do not die. The bullets ricochet off them, bouncing around the room, striking the shooters. The daughters have sewn diamonds and jewels into their clothing, a desperate attempt to hide their valuables from the guards. The gems act as armor, deflecting the bullets. The girls huddle against the wall, still alive, still screaming. The shooters panic. They use bayonets, stabbing again and again. They fire at close range, aiming for heads. The room becomes a slaughterhouse, blood spraying the walls, pooling on the floor. One by one, the children fall. When it is over, 11 bodies lie in the basement. The shooters stand panting, covered in blood, staring at what they have done. Yurovsky checks each body, ensuring that no one breathes. They are all dead, all 11. The bodies are loaded onto a truck and driven into the forest outside the city. They are stripped, mutilated, doused with acid and gasoline. The remains are thrown into an abandoned mine shaft, then retrieved and buried in a shallow grave, hidden under railway ties. The world will not know the truth for decades. In the Ipatiev House, the blood is scrubbed from the walls and floor. The rooms are cleaned, the evidence erased. When the White Army enters Yekaterinburg a week later, they find the house empty, the family gone, the rumors swirling. They will search for years, for decades, for evidence of what happened in that basement room. They will not find it until 1979, when amateur sleuths discover the grave. By then, the Soviet Union has hardened around the lie, and the truth is dangerous. The remains are reburied, hidden again, waiting for history to catch up. The Romanovs are gone. 304 years after that frightened boy said yes in a monastery cell, the dynasty ends not with a crown, but with a bullet. Not in glory, but in blood. Not in the Kremlin, but in a basement in a provincial town, the hinges screaming as the door closes for the last time. The glitter and doom of an empire, the jewels sewn into the dresses of princesses, meant to save them, became their shroud. The faith that sustained them through exile became their prayer in the final seconds. The love that bound them together became the last thing they saw in each other's eyes. They died as they lived, together. The snow falls on Yekaterinburg as it fell on Kostromar 3 centuries before. It covers the grave, the mine shaft, the railway ties. It covers the blood in the basement, the jewels scattered in the forest, the prayers whispered into the darkness. It falls on the city that killed them and on the country that forgot them. But snow melts, history thaws, and the truth, buried so deep, so carefully, so completely, eventually rises. The bodies are found, the bones are identified. The Romanovs come home at last, laid to rest in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, beside the ancestors who ruled before them. The last Tsar, the last Tsarina, the children who never grew up, they lie in the same crypt, together, finally at peace. The crowds gather outside the cathedral. Some weep, some pray, some curse. The old woman who remembers the Tsar as a distant, godlike figure, the young man who learned about the murder in school, presented as justice, the priest who chants the ancient prayers, the same prayers that sustain the family in the Ipatiev House. They are all there, witnesses to the end of a story that began in fear and ended in blood. And in the silence that follows, in the space between the last prayer and the first movement of the crowd, something hovers, a question unspoken but felt by all who stand there. What was it for? The empire that rose from the time of troubles, that stretched across a continent, that produced giants and madmen, reformers and reactionaries, saints and sinners, what was it for? The ambition of Peter, the enlightenment of Catherine, the reforms of Alexandra, the faith of Nicholas. What did they build and what did they destroy? The answer lies in the bones beneath the stones, in the jewels scattered in the forest, in the blood on the basement floor. The Romanovs were not gods. They were not demons. They were people flawed, frightened, loving, failing, who tried to hold together a country too vast, too poor, too angry to be held. They succeeded for 300 years. And then, in a single night, they failed. The snow falls. The crowds disperse. The cathedral doors close. And the story of the Romanovs becomes what it has always been, a memory, a warning, a prayer whispered into the darkness by those who still believe that love is stronger than death. The hinges scream, the door closes, the light goes out. But the story does not end. It cannot end. As long as Russia exists, the Romanovs will exist, in its memory, in its wounds, in its longing for a past that never was and a future that may never come. They are the glitter and the doom, the glory and the shame, the dream and the nightmare of an empire that tried to touch the sky and fell into the earth. And we, who come after, stand at the edge of that abyss and wonder, what would we have done? What would we have believed? What would we have prayed for in the final seconds as the door opened and the guns raised? The snow falls. The answer falls with it, silent, white, and cold.